By every measure the enemy used to judge a tank, this one should have lost. It wasn't the thickest, it wasn't the best armed. On a good day, a German Panther could kill it from a distance where the Sherman's own gun would simply bounce off. Crews gave it nicknames you don't give a machine you trust with your life. The Tommy Cooker, the Ronson, after the lighter that lights first time every time. It burned, it bogged, it drowned coming off the landing craft. And historians have spent 80 years arguing about whether it was a war winner or a death trap. And yet, here it is, years after the war that built it ended, still running, still fighting, still showing up on battlefields its designers never imagined, under flags that didn't exist when it rolled off the line. This is the strange truth about the M4 Sherman. It was never the best tank on any single battlefield. It might have been the most important one on all of them. This is the story of the tank that wouldn't die. To understand why the Sherman wouldn't die, you have to understand what it actually was. And the first thing to know is that it wasn't really designed as a weapon. It was designed as a product. When American engineers sat down to design a medium tank in 1941, they weren't asking, "What's the most powerful tank we can imagine?" They were asking a more practical, more American question. What's the best tank we can build 10,000 of, ship across an ocean, and keep running in a field with teenagers and hand tools? That question shaped every rivet. Let's deal in numbers, because the Sherman's own manuals are surprisingly honest about it. Take the M4A3, one of the most common American variants. Powered by a Ford V8 tank engine, 8 cylinders, liquid-cooled, rated at 500 horsepower. 5 forward gears, 1 reverse. Top sustained speed on a hard road, about 26 miles an hour. Armor? The front slope of the hull, 2 inches. The sides, 1.5 inches. The turret front, the thickest plate on the tank, 3 inches of cast steel. By the standards of 1942, that was respectable. By the standards of 1944, against a German 88, it was a polite suggestion. But here's the thing the spec sheet doesn't shout. This tank was built to be fixed. Look at this page from the maintenance manual. That's a man turning the entire engine over, by hand, with a bar, to check it before starting. The Sherman was full of moments like this, designed so that the people keeping it alive didn't need a factory. They needed a wrench and a manual. These charts look boring. They are the most underrated weapon of the Second World War. Every grease fitting, every oil interval, every drain plug, mapped, numbered, standardized. A Sherman that threw a track in the morning could be back in the line by afternoon. A Panther that broke its final drive was often simply gone. Too complex, too heavy, too far from the factory that alone could save it. And the Sherman took this flexibility further than almost any tank in history. Because America had no single purpose-built tank engine, the M4 became a family defined by whatever the country could bolt into the back of it. A Continental radial, an aircraft engine really, a Ford V8, a pair of General Motors bus diesels bolted side by side. Even, in one variant, 5 automobile engines ganged together on a single crankshaft. One tank, many hearts. All of them serviceable. That wasn't a compromise, that was the entire philosophy. The Sherman was an industrial argument before it was a tactical one. And the scale of that argument is hard to overstate. America built nearly 50,000 Shermans. 50,000. Only the Soviet T-34 was produced in greater numbers, and the T-34 was a brilliant, brutal tank in its own right. But it was built one way, in one country, for one front. The Sherman was built in dozens of factories that had never made a weapon in their lives. Locomotive works, automobile plants, shipyards. By a nation that turned tank building into an assembly line. When you can lose a tank in the morning and have a replacement crated and shipped by the end of the month, the question stops being, is my tank better than yours? And becomes, can you afford to keep killing them? For the Germans, the answer was no. This is the uncomfortable heart of the Sherman story. It was, in a sense, a consumable, designed to be replaceable. And in a war of attrition against an enemy who could not replace his own losses, replaceability wasn't a weakness, it was the whole game. Step inside and the Sherman stops being a diagram and becomes a workplace. A very cramped, very loud, very dangerous workplace shared by 5 men. Up front, low and to the left, the driver. He doesn't have a wheel. He has two steering levers. Pull the left to turn left, the right to turn right, a clutch, a throttle, and a gear shift. Driving a Sherman was less like driving a car and more like wrestling one. Beside him, the assistant driver, who doubled as the bow machine gunner, hunched behind a ball-mounted .30 caliber poking through the front plate. Above and behind them, in the turret, the other three. The loader, the gunner, and the commander head up in the hatch whenever he dared, because a buttoned-up tank is a blind tank. This is where the fight happened. The gunner traversed the turret, by hand with a wheel or fast with a hydraulic power drive, laid the gun, and fired. The loader fed it. The commander saw the battlefield and made the calls. 3 men in a space smaller than a closet performing a violent, choreographed routine under fire. And surrounding all of them, ammunition. Nearly 100 rounds of 75 millimeter, thousands of machine gun rounds, tucked into sponsons, racked under the turret basket, wedged into every void. This detail matters. Remember it, because it's going to come back, and it's going to hurt. Now, the gun. People love to mock the Sherman 75 millimeter as undergunned, but that misunderstands what it was for. This was not built to win duels with heavy tanks. It was built to support infantry, and for that, it was excellent. Look at this, a deep-cavity, high-explosive shell. The Sherman's job, 90% of the time, wasn't killing tanks. It was killing the machine gun nest, the anti-tank gun, the strong point pinning down the infantry it rode alongside. At that, the 75 was one of the best guns of the war. Around the main gun, a web of machine guns, one beside it, one in the bow, and the big one, a .50 caliber Browning on the roof, equally happy chewing up trucks, infantry, or low-flying aircraft. The Sherman wasn't a sniper. It was a mobile, armored fire support system that happened to be able to fight other tanks when it had to. Judge it as a tank duelist, and it disappoints. Judge it as what it actually was, and it starts to look like exactly the right machine. But let's be honest. A documentary that only praises its subject is just an advertisement. The Sherman had real, fatal flaws, and the men who crewed it paid for them. The first was the gun problem, in reverse. The same 75 that was so good against infantry struggled against the front armor of the late-war German heavies. A Tiger or a Panther could often engage a Sherman from 1,000 yards or more, distances at which the Sherman's standard rounds simply could not punch through. To kill one, a Sherman crew frequently had to do something terrifying, maneuver, under fire, to get a shot at the flank. It cost tanks. It cost lives. The second flaw is the one that named it. The Sherman had a reputation for burning, catastrophically. The Ronson, the Tommy Cooker. Crews told grim jokes about how fast it lit up. But here's where the myth and the reality part ways. For years, people blamed the gasoline engine. The truth, investigators found, was worse and more specific. It wasn't usually the fuel that killed a Sherman. It was the ammunition. When a penetrating round reached those rounds packed around the crew, the propellant ignited, and a tank full of high explosive became an inferno in seconds. The Sherman didn't burn because it was a bad tank. It burned because it was a metal box wrapped around dozens of charges of cordite. And this is the part of the story that gets left out. They fixed it. Engineers redesigned the ammunition stowage, moving the rounds down low, wrapping them in jackets of water and antifreeze. Wet stowage, they called it. The effect was dramatic. Tanks that took a hit were now far less likely to burn at all. The Sherman learned from the men it had failed. Here's the statistic the death trap reputation buries. When a Sherman was knocked out, its crew very often got out. The roomy hull, the multiple hatches, the low ammunition fire rate after wet stowage, a hit Sherman was frequently survivable. The crews that bailed out lived to crew another one. And there was always, always another one. That's the first half of why it wouldn't die. Not the steel, the men who kept climbing back in. It's worth pausing on the reputation itself, because it has a history of its own. After the war, the image of the Sherman as a flaming death trap hardened into legend, fueled in part by the memoirs of men who'd watched friends burn and who never forgave the machine for it. That grief was real, and it deserves respect. But when later historians went back to the actual loss records, tank by tank, casualty by casualty, a more complicated picture emerged. The Sherman's crew survival rate compared favorably to almost every tank it fought alongside or against. The legend, it turned out, was built on the most vivid, most horrifying outcomes, not the average one. Both things are true at once. The Sherman could die terribly, and the Sherman was, statistically, one of the more survivable places to be when armor met armor. History is rarely as clean as a nickname. The second half is geography. Because while the Tiger and the Panther fought in a relatively narrow band of Europe, the Sherman fought everywhere. And the same baseline tank did radically different jobs depending on where you dropped it. In the Pacific, there were almost no enemy tanks worth the name. Here, the Sherman became the infantry's battering ram, rolling up to bunkers and caves that had pinned down Marines for days and simply ending the argument at point-blank range. Its reliability mattered more here than its gun ever did. A tank that ran through mud, coral, and jungle rot was worth more than one with thicker armor that broke down. And on islands like Iwo Jima, the Sherman became something out of a nightmare, a flame tank. Where high explosive failed to clear a fortified cave, fire did. Brutal, decisive work, and only possible because the chassis was reliable enough and plentiful enough to convert into specialist tools. In Europe, it was a different war entirely. Mud, towns, hedgerows, rivers. The Sherman ground through Italian ruins and French farmland and German streets, not always winning the glamorous duels, but arriving in numbers again and again wherever the front needed armor. And because the chassis was so adaptable, it spawned an entire menagerie of specialist machines. This one, the rotating drum and chains, is a mine-clearing flail, beating the ground ahead of the advance to set off buried mines harmlessly. Others became mobile bridges, recovery vehicles, rocket launchers, amphibious swimmers that floated ashore under their own power on D-Day. The Sherman wasn't just a tank, it was a platform, and that platform showed up in every theater of the war, doing jobs no one had drawn on the original blueprint. That's the second reason it wouldn't die. It was never asked to be perfect for one battlefield. It was asked to be adequate for all of them. And adequacy, multiplied by tens of thousands and shipped to every corner of the planet, turned out to be a kind of dominance the Germans never had an answer for. And it wasn't only American crews inside them. The Sherman was the Allied tank. The British and the Commonwealth fought in them from the deserts of North Africa to the heart of Germany. And it was British ingenuity that produced the deadliest Sherman of all, cramming a powerful 17-pounder anti-tank gun into the turret to create a version that could, finally, kill a Panther from the front. The Soviets received thousands under Lend-Lease, favoring the quiet, reliable diesel variants, and crewed them all the way to Berlin. Free French, Polish, Canadian, New Zealand units, they all went to war in the same forgiving steel box. No single nation owned the Sherman. It belonged to a coalition. And a tank that an entire alliance can build, ship, crew, and repair interchangeably is a tank that is very, very hard to make disappear. And then the war ended. The Tiger and the Panther, the tanks that had so outclassed it on paper, went to the scrapyards and the museums. Their factories were rubble. The empires that built them were finished. The Sherman just kept going. 5 years after VE Day, American Shermans were fighting again, this time in Korea, grinding up brutal mountain roads, trading fire with Soviet-built T-34s. The obsolete tank of 1945 was a frontline war winner in 1951. By now, the men crewing it weren't the men who'd built its reputation. They were a new generation, painting tiger faces on the hull, making the old machine their own. The Sherman had outlived its own legend and started a second career. And it didn't stop with the major powers. America and Britain had built so many Shermans that they flooded the world. The tank turned up in revolutions and border wars and proxy conflicts across the Middle East, Latin America, and Asia. Nations that couldn't build a tank could buy, or be given, a Sherman, and keep it running on those same, simple, forgiving systems. Some were rebuilt almost beyond recognition, fitted with bigger French guns, new engines, new optics, and they soldiered on into the 1960s and beyond. In the deserts of the Middle East, upgunned Shermans fought tank battles against far more modern machines and won, in the hands of crews who knew exactly how to squeeze every last advantage out of an old, familiar friend. In South Asia, in Latin America, in conflicts most of the world has forgotten, the Sherman kept turning up, because it was cheap to run, easy to teach, and nearly impossible to wear out. Tanks designed in 1941 were still rolling into combat a quarter of a century later. Show me another weapon of the Second World War that can say the same. That's the literal meaning of the title. Not just the crews who survived and climbed back in. The design itself, too useful, too reliable, too plentiful to ever quite be retired. So let's go back to where we started. This tank, knocked out, burning, written off by every spec sheet the enemy used. The Sherman teaches a lesson that armies and engineers are still arguing about today. It is this: the best weapon is not always the most powerful one. Sometimes the best weapon is the one that's there, the one that runs, the one you can fix, the one you have 10,000 of when your enemy has 10. The Germans built magnificent tanks, and never enough of them, and could never keep enough of them running. America built a good enough tank, and then built it until the sheer mathematics of it became unanswerable. Reliability over brilliance, numbers over perfection, logistics over glory. That's not just how the Sherman fought, that's how America fought, and in many ways, how it still does. There's a Sherman in one of these photographs with a name painted on its flank: Eternity. The crewman who chose it probably meant it as a grim joke, a tank named for how long the war felt. But it turned out to be the truest thing anyone ever wrote on the side of an M4. Because the tank they kept writing off, the Ronson, the Tommy Cooker, the Death Trap, the obsolete Relic, kept showing up. War after war, decade after decade, flag after flag. The tank that wouldn't die.